death toll for media workers in the country.
Last month, South Africans laid to rest one of their iconic anti-apartheid leaders, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. For all those years that her husband, Nelson Mandela, was imprisoned, Mama Winnie, as she was known, moved to the front line in the fight against white minority rule, earning the respect of her people and the ire of the apartheid-era government. Which is why, in the days after her death, many South Africans took exception to the way her obituaries read, how she had been reduced to the former wife of a president who played a bit part in the struggle, or was caricatured as an angry, vengeful woman who had lost her way. Then, just days before her funeral, a documentary aired in the country that showed how the apartheid government, with the help of the white-owned news media, had smeared Madikizela-Mandela with deceptions and lies that made it into those obits. That documentary changed things. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, her life, death, and partial rehabilitation in the media.
Ex-wife of the late President Nelson Mandela, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela.
She was a powerful yet controversial figure.
When news broke of Winnie Madikizela-Mandela's death and the obits started coming out, it soon became clear that some news outlets hadn't done their homework.
From the mother of the nation to a tarnished reputation.
Beautiful, brave, but also brutal.
Madikizela-Mandela, unlike her husband, became the evil that she condemned.
Because the role of the person many considered a titan of the anti-apartheid struggle was being diminished.
The obits were flat. They just didn't have the kind of work that should have been done for this individual. I mean, you had one editor refer to her as damaged goods.
In international media reports, you had Reuters referring to her as the mother then mugger of the nation. And the New York Times said that her legacy in apartheid as a liberator was overshadowed by scandal. You had the BBC referring her as Mandela's wife. That was all that she was diminished to, just his wife.
And you have this backlash, this groundswell from the public, which says that is not the only Winnie Mandela who existed. And so you see this remarkable shift in the narrative, especially local media, covering her now in a much more respectful way.
To understand why so many South Africans objected to the portrayal of Madikizela-Mandela in the days after her death, it helps to look at her life. In 1964, she and her two young children watched as her husband, Nelson Mandela, was sentenced to life in prison. The apartheid government outlawed the African National Congress, the ANC, and prohibited journalists from covering the party in any way that supposedly advanced its so-called terrorist agenda. The struggle for liberation that had been gaining momentum was dealt a severe blow.
In the midst of this, there was one person, Winnie Mandela, who seemed to live without fear, who spoke out, who spoke on behalf of the banned organization, who spoke on behalf of her husband, and was a very powerful image and figure. So she kept that voice alive.
But she also develops quite an important relationship with people in the grassroots. And so in some ways, if an international or domestic media is interested in understanding the feeling of the people, they do so through the lens of a Winnie Mandela.
As such a visible leader of the resistance, Madikizela-Mandela needed to be silenced. For 2 decades, the apartheid government harassed her, shuttled her in and out of prison, held her in solitary confinement, reportedly tortured and demeaned her, and eventually, in 1977, banished her to a remote part of the country. 8 years later, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela defied the government and returned to the media spotlight. This time, the world saw a different side to her, with ratcheted-up rhetoric, a new militancy.
With our necklaces, we shall liberate this country.
Many saw that as an endorsement of necklacing, a brutal form of execution predominantly in black communities, where suspected police informants had tires filled with petrol placed around their necks that were then set alight. The apartheid government and its media apparatus looked at the new Madikizela-Mandela and her personal bodyguards and enforcers who operated under the name of the Mandela United Football Club and saw an opportunity.
The government, who pretended like it was, conducting this war by parliamentary rules, when in fact it was conducting a dirty war, and Winnie Mandela's attitude was, we should respond, fire with fire. The ANC actually said by the late 1980s, make the country ungovernable. People would burn things, would protest. And so Winnie Mandela became sort of the personification of that kind of politics. And so there were excesses. The government could exploit those excesses.
I was co-editor of the Weekly Mail, and this story started to emerge. In particular, we had one or two young reporters who came and said, there's an issue, there's a problem, there's increasing complaints about the behavior of this football club. The question for us was how to cover it, because the security police and the apartheid state would be eager to use any information and controversy to damage the liberation movement.
By the late 1980s, it emerged that the apartheid government had created a covert unit called Stratcom that specialized in spreading misinformation and propaganda against opponents of the state. As many as 40 journalists were involved from multiple news organizations, and among the anti-apartheid leaders they targeted, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. In 1989, Stratcom got a story it could work with. A young boy named Stompie Sepe was accused of being a police informant. He was kidnapped, tortured, and then murdered by members of the Mandela United Football Club. When arrested, they said that the order had come from Madikizela-Mandela, and while she was never convicted of any involvement in the murder, only in the kidnapping of Sepe, the story was explosive enough for Stratcom, through its media network, to start turning black South Africans against her.
It becomes the single story about Winnie Mandela. And so here is where I think the media, both domestically and internationally, errs. It begins to see Winnie Mandela only as a caricature and only as the woman who had something to do with the Stompie Sepe matter. In fact, she was convicted of kidnapping him. And her reasons for that kidnap were that she was taking him to a place of safety.
A lot of people started to turn against her. There were graffitis on walls saying, Winnie must hang and give us Nelson Mandela back, take Winnie to Robben Island. And so that was the effect of that coverage on Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. She was completely denied by her own people.
I think she, for all intents and purposes, disappears and becomes something of a bit of a pariah in post-apartheid South Africa. She doesn't live on TV, in the papers, in books, in documentaries. She doesn't live in that way.
That was until 3 days before Madikizela-Mandela's funeral. A documentary called Winnie aired on a domestic TV channel. It showed through interviews with former Stratcom agents how Madikizela-Mandela had been targeted in the media.
I already had about 40 journalists working directly or indirectly for me. So through them, I could have specific reports placed in newspapers and it would be front page.
Even back then, she tried to warn South Africans about the coverage of the Stompie Sepe story.
The deliberate and mischievous lies that keep being perpetrated by the media is beyond anything we have seen.
And then the kicker, that Jerry Richardson, the member of the Mandela United Football Club who had killed Stompie and then pointed the finger at Winnie, was in fact a police informant himself. There have been questions over the veracity of some of the claims made in the film, but for many South Africans, the documentary reiterated why they were so angry with some of the initial coverage of Madikizela-Mandela's death, because it read like apartheid-era propaganda.
The documentary, it was a piece, I think, of necessary revisionism, historical revisionism. But I think because when Winnie Mandela died, and all the grievances that people have about the way we talk about women and political struggle, or women and violence, kind of came back.
I think the tragedy is, and it's really been accentuated in this period of mourning since her death, that we have two competing caricatures of her. We seem unable to move beyond either Winnie as the extraordinary hero or Winnie the witch. And the truth is, they are both crude caricatures. And she's a complicated human being that, like all of us, comes with baggage from the ugly racist past.